Typically, when we work for one of our clients, the job is confined to one day, usually a very long day, as in 10, 11 hours. That doesn't include packing the car, driving to the site, etc. Salem Town in Winston-Salem, a project that we photographed for Frank L. Bloom Construction, proved to top all of the logistical challenges we faced on an architectural shoot since the day the company began. Imagine, if you can, an absolutely huge complex in which a simple wrong turn at the end of a corridor can take you down a blind path that will leave you totally disoriented and without direction. This was one of those complexes, and to make matters worse, it was actually 3 stories. So getting lost on the second floor could be quite problematic. We began by taking a walk through the entire facility with our clients. While we generally know what they consider to be important from a visual and emotional perspective, on a project of this size, it's really important for us to figure out exactly what they would like to narrow down the possibilities to. Imagine, for example, there were no less than a dozen different eating areas. Some different, some very similar, some only marginally different. It's not necessary to photograph all of them, but to get a sense from the client of which ones they consider to be demonstrating the best of what they can do. That's in part what this is all about. So we spent the initial 2+ hours wandering through the facility with our clients. Once that was completed, J.D. Milazzo and I had to figure out exactly how we were going to handle this complex. Now, keep in mind, when we do work like this, we often are photographing the facility as people are moving in real time. So we had to talk to the people who were delivering the furniture to determine when the furniture was going to arrive in very specific areas that we needed to photograph. We had to work around people who were moving into their rooms in the facility. We had to talk to the rehabilitation staff about how and when they would be working in some of the areas that were critical to the shoot. And if all of that weren't enough, we had to deal with some significant environmental issues. For example, the best shot of the facade of the building could only happen late in the afternoon because otherwise, for most of the day, the sun would be behind the building. That would obscure some of the very important detail. Second, there was a gorgeous atrium, and in the middle of the atrium was a huge auditorium that featured barn board from trees that were taken down during the construction of the building. One of the ideas that they implemented here was to reuse as much of the local lumber as possible in the construction of the building. To be able to work in that area and to still deal with the light coming in from the atrium meant that we had to work around the patterns of the sun moving across the building. And at that time of year, it was particularly difficult because the days were quite long. When the project was finally complete, at least from our perspective, we ended up spending 3 days on site. We developed a very intricate and complex plan for how we were going to work with each of the individual areas, and we executed it according to plan. I'd like to note a comment I've made before. Just because you don't see an area as reflective doesn't mean it isn't highly reflective. When the sun is at a very obtuse angle in relationship to a building, a lot of surfaces that are ordinarily matte can in fact become quite bright. We had to work around that. And one of the most complex things we had to work with was the fact that there were hallways with very narrow windows outside some of the eating areas. Lighting those hallways proved to be the biggest challenge that we would face. Very narrow spaces don't lend themselves well for strobes. In addition to that, when the strobes discharge, there's always the possibility that an unforeseen area will suddenly light up and become a mirror. So in the end, areas that you would think would have been very simple for us to photograph turned out to be the most complex and most difficult. So let's review. Number one, always walk through the space with a client if you can do that. We know Frank L. Bloom well enough that in many cases we no longer have to do that. But knowing the ultimate emotional and visual experience the client would like you to portray is critical to the success of the project. Number two, always develop a strategic plan. Don't just walk in and start shooting. When a building is about to open, the logistics can be quite daunting, especially when it involves painters, carpenters, furniture people, interior decorators, a madhouse. Work with everyone involved to develop a plan so that you are as unobtrusive as possible. And finally, really look closely at the space. Sometimes those spaces that should be the easiest will be the most complex and most difficult. Remember to pace yourself. When you're lugging around strobes and a lot of other equipment, it can be quite daunting and quite exhausting. Thanks for listening. Hope to see you next time.